the Amazon is really lawless in swaths. I think it's something a lot of people don't know. A lot of drug trafficking organizations have links to illegal mining. For instance, that's how they fund their operations. The kicker to all of this is that when Ecuador has to pay that $800 million to the company, it's Ecuadorian taxpayers. So it's these people who the company polluted in the first place who are, footing this bill in part. And when I talk to some of them, I mean, they have no faith in the justice system and legal systems because they don't serve them. One of my sources, Eduardo Mandua, was murdered in his garden in broad daylight, and he was a huge opponent of oil expansion on indigenous Cofayan land. His wife and children, are left behind. These deaths ripple, and it is a way of, getting people to back down, to not speak up, to not stand up, in protection of their territories.
What if I told you there's a hidden global system letting corporations sue countries for billions? Or that rivers and forests are winning legal rights against mining giants? This isn't theory, it's happening right now. We are diving into the collision between two worlds. One where profit dominates law, and another where ecosystems and defenders fight for survival. It's about power, violence, and a radical question. Can our laws protect life, not just capital? To guide us through this complex and often dangerous territory, we are joined by a very special guest. Katie Surma is an award-winning climate journalist with Inside Climate News. But before she reported from the front lines of the climate crisis, she spent over a decade as a commercial lawyer. This unique path gives her a powerful lens through which to view the very legal systems she now investigates. In our discussion, we'll uncover the true cost of global development, confront the deadly risks for environmental defenders, and explore the movement to grant rights to nature and criminalize ecocide. Thank you so much, Katie, for joining me in this conversation. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Katie, you're the first climate journalist on this podcast, and to kick off this conversation, it would be great to just learn from you that what climate story is dominating your mind these days.
Sure. Well, you know, one thing about being a journalist is you get to go kind of all in on what you're doing at the moment. And this year, I'm working with two of my colleagues at Inside Climate News, looking at the climate and environmental impacts of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it's overseas investing in different development projects, and it's a really interesting story. I mean, it's a huge story, because China's one of the biggest overseas investors in renewable energy. So solar, wind, it dominates those supply chains. And of course, this is very much in the news with the trade war that's going on with the United States. But my colleagues and I are also learning that program has had immense environmental impacts and negative climate impacts as well. So I've been a bit laser focused on that this year, and got to go to Argentina earlier this year to do some reporting, and just got back from Zambia.
Yeah, that's very interesting in considering how China has been expanding its own renewable foothold, but at the same time, its impact overseas is something that we sometimes don't often consider. So that of course creates a push and pull with respect to how green is the economy and how not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a challenge to report on because it's a very, I mean, in the US, it's a very charged topic. And so we've very much narrowed our focus to just looking at, environment, climate, human rights, impacts of it. And so we're expecting to produce some interesting stories this year.
Talking about challenging stories, Katie, you report on human rights, you report on environmental defenders, you report on rights of nature, which in itself happen to be at the borders of environmental law, which a lot of people might not like or appreciate. So that work in itself becomes very challenging. Diving more into your work, would you want to share some of the stories that you've reported in the past which have really brought out that conflict with respect to your work and with respect to some of the other dominant interests that have tried to push back your work? If you would want to share some of those stories.
Yeah, no, of course, and thank you for that question. When I explain to people, um, I'd like to frame it sort of as introduce them to what I do and the way I came to it, which is, I practiced law for 12 years in, commercial kind of litigation space, so something totally different. And I started doing reporting for Inside Climate News around 2021, and I almost immediately started reporting on two things. One is the rights of nature movement, which is this global push to get governments to recognize that ecosystems and wildlife have inherent rights to life, um, and that humans need to respect those rights. And then on the other end of things, I started reporting on this legal system. It's this international legal system that gives corporations, really foreign investors, but corporations are the main users of the system, special rights to sue governments when their rights are impacted. So on one hand, looking at a non-human entity, corporations having these very strong, powerful rights that they're winning billions of dollars of awards in this system. It's called investor state dispute settlement. Then on the other hand, sort of a grassroots movement for nature to have basic rights, a right to exist or a whale's right to migrate recognized. And just that framing of things really forced me to start thinking about why do we design our legal systems the way we do, and what do those choices mean? What are the consequences of that? And so one of the sort of my first on the ground reporting on the rights of nature anyway was in Brazil. And it was a great example of kind of both of these things in action. I was with a bunch of rights of nature activists, and we were on a bus traveling through the northern Amazon for, I think it was like 10 days or 2 weeks. And we were looking at all sorts of development projects from, hydroelectric dams to highways and mines, railways. And we're talking to communities that were impacted by these projects. And it really clarified for me that not everyone in the world thinks of progress or development the way that, Western cultures do. That, a lot of environmentalists in the United States, for instance, when we think about hydroelectric power, we think it's clean power because it's not fossil fuels. Well, these communities along the riverside who've been displaced from this dam, their lives have been completely upended. It's cut them off from their traditional ways of living, their ways of getting food and income. And so that really, for me, was eye-opening. Questions about development, but I also think, on that trip, we went to this town called Anapu, where there was this, ceremony going on commemorating this American nun named Dorothy Stang, and she had been murdered, I think back in 2005, for standing with Indigenous peoples in the area against ranching that was, coming in on their lands. And seeing the violence that's linked to things that we benefit from back in the United States. Oftentimes, it's our companies that are going there. Um, and so that trip was pretty foundational for me, and it sort of it really clarified these two ways of thinking, and seeing the world, and how one way, our way of thinking of progress and development has kind of collided into so many people. Um, and I get to write about sort of what does that look like, and pose the question of what does that mean?
No, thank you so much for highlighting that. In fact, I read that story that you authored, and I saw that that your efforts were also recognized by an association, and you received an award for that reporting as well. Uh, Picking up the cue from that story itself, Katie, I think that your experience was around Belmont Dam in Zengu River. Maybe if my pronunciation's not wrong. Uh, and I think the interesting part there, as you highlight, I think the contrary ideas of development that we see. And these contrary ideas of development are, of course, transpired by differing worldviews altogether. I'm not sure if it's the right question for a journalist, but I'm just curious, do you see two of these worldviews ever coinciding with each other? Because I think your work takes you right into the heart of indigenous communities as well. But at the same time, we sitting in cities also happen to have the privilege of enjoying the other worldview as well. So, in your experience, as I see that the trip was called 1,000 miles across Amazon, if I'm not wrong, right? So,
Yeah.
does that trip give you some more enlightenment with respect to, can these two worldviews coexist? Can these two worldviews coincide?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. First, the first thing that comes to mind is I've never come across a source who said, all development has to stop. We need to just, end things as they are, and or that, no hunting can occur, that sort of thing. Everyone should be a vegetarian. I mean, there are people who espouse that. There's a lot of vegans, but I mean, the indigenous people, or other folks who I've talked to, who are pushing the rights of nature movement, they are advocating for, um, maintaining the integrity of ecosystems, to ensure that, a forest can continue to do what a forest does, or a species can continue to procreate and migrate, those sort of big picture things. And of course, many of these communities are some of the biggest hunters, right? This is like their livelihoods, hunting and fishing. So just clarifying that. But I mean, they are coexisting in a way. I always steer people to Ecuador as an example, because it's the country that has come the farthest along in progressing jurisprudence on the rights of nature. I mean, if you talk to anyone in the rights of nature movement, I'm sure they'll point you to Ecuador. But it's, in their 2008 constitution, recognizes the rights of Pachamama, or Mother Earth. And there's dozens of cases that have come out, and they try to just rebalance, right, human interests and the interests of ecosystems. Cloud forests have prevailed over mining companies. More recently, marine ecosystems prevailed over industrial fishing. Um, and so, they're trying to imagine a way where these two things kind of coexist. Ecuador development is marching on, right? It's producing a lot of oil, there's mining. But there's also, folks who are trying to find alternatives to what I'd say is like the extractive system. Extractivism being, taking resources, logging, or pumping oil, mining, and exporting them. And uh, that's a model. I describe it as like a political and economic model that wherever you look at it around the world, it keeps replicating, having the same harms come out. And there are a lot of communities that have always lived in a different way, more communally typically, but they're also pioneering kind of solutions to exist in a world where we have, development technologies and comforts, but it's more sustainable. Um, so I am seeing that. They certainly are, in the grand scheme of things, not winning the battle, but there's areas where they're pushing through.
It's good to know from your perspective that yes, these two worldviews can coexist and are trying to find their own niche. And I think, of course, there are things to be learned from both these spectrums if we can find a balance there. Um, as we're talking about this 10-day trip, would you want to highlight some of the other stories or an incident with respect to environmental defenders as well? Because as you just mentioned about this story about the nun, and it was, to me, reading it was also very moving just from the perspective that we call Amazon the area as the lungs of the earth, but at the same time, it's the local defenders who are paying the price for protecting it.
Yeah.
Uh, so maybe if you want to characterize some of their challenges.
Sure. Yeah, and environmental defenders is I write about them a good bit. We call them environmental defenders. They're people who peacefully resist extractive industries, peacefully try to protect forests and other ecosystems. And I think the numbers are around like 200 of them are documented killed each year, and there's other killed or attacked, a combination, and that's like a huge undercount because there's swaths of the world where press is suppressed, NGOs are suppressed, and so there's just not reporting when this happens. These incidents also happen in remote areas, so they're often not counted. Um, the Amazon is really lawless in swaths. I think it's something a lot of people don't know. A lot of drug trafficking organizations have links to illegal mining. For instance, that's how they fund their operations. Um, and in Anapu, um, we met with some of Sister Dorothy's colleagues, also with local folks, and I think they told us like in the recent years, like 20 people had been killed. Other people had, I mean, gruesome crimes: tongues cut out, ears cut off. Children are targeted to discipline their parents. Um, and this isn't just like a Brazil thing. In Ecuador, for instance, one of my sources, Eduardo Mandua, was murdered in his garden in broad daylight, and he was a huge opponent of oil expansion on indigenous Cofayan land. His wife and children, are left behind. These deaths ripple, and it is a way of, getting people to back down, to not speak up, to not stand up, in protection of their territories. Um, they're compelling stories. I mean, it's everyone is a tragedy, and it's something I definitely want to report more on. It's a problem that's not going away. You know, Mining in particular is ramping up, and I think that if I'm not mistaken, it's the industry that's most linked to the most attacks globally.
Katie, considering like connecting this thought to your previous observation that you were saying that like why do we design the legal systems that we do? Uh, do you blame or do you see the incapacity of our legal systems behind what we see right now in Amazon. I mean, what I'm trying to get at, is it like, as a lawyer yourself, you would appreciate like how legal systems happen to operate in a societal framework. Like there's a porous relationship between how society governs and the legal mechanisms. What I'm trying to understand is that like these laws of lives is a systemic pattern, and does that pattern exist because of the legal frameworks, or there's something more at play here?
Yeah, I mean, so when I talk to people, people who are living this reality, they describe rampant impunity, right? They describe legal systems as something often that's like foreign, that doesn't serve them. I mean, that's how they see it, and I think that speaks volumes. Um, I've reported on some cases where you know, people, indigenous people, are are held to the outcome of a legal case without having any participation in it or knowledge that it's even going on. The sort of epic Chevron, Ecuador, Texaco pollution is one example of that. Um, but another case I reported on from Ecuador was on this French oil company named Perenco that came in, and it you know it upended people's lives. People complained about pollution from this company for decades and never had their grievances addressed by the Ecuadorian government or anyone else. They even tried to go after the company back in France, and the French legal system said, no, no, you can't come here. And Ecuador's president at one point tried to set a windfall tax on oil profits. And so Perenco, the oil company, sued Ecuador and ISDS, that system I was describing at the beginning of the call about, that gives corporations special rights. And Perenco and its partner, a US company, ended up winning $800 million in a judgment from Ecuador. And during the case, Ecuador's government all of a sudden became very interested in the pollution that the company had caused, thinking that it could use that to try to mitigate how much it would have to pay to Perenco. And so, it came out like just how badly Perenco had polluted the Amazon and validated everything that these local people were saying. And so, the kicker to all of this is that when Ecuador has to pay that $800 million to the company, it's Ecuadorian taxpayers. So it's these people who the company polluted in the first place who are, footing this bill in part. And when I talk to some of them, I mean, they have no faith in the justice system and legal systems because they don't serve them. All of these ISDS hearings, for instance, they took place in like Washington, D.C. or in France, and just completely disconnected from the lives of people on the ground. So I, I think there's a real legitimacy problem. And, it- you know, yeah, there's a real legitimacy problem.
No, I mean, it's fascinating that how even in today's time you see ISDS operating at such a huge scale, and in fact, punishing countries for climate action, and it goes on unabated. So I'm glad that journalists and academics are taking interest in reporting it much more, and the new treaties which are coming out are sensitive that which claims should be open to ISDS. But this story, makes me think of so many other matters which might exist out there, but might not get enough reporting or attention. Would you want to take some time and maybe pick and choose one of your the stories that you might have reported or of your interest, which you think requires much more attention and concern from the public and the government alike?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. There's
We're
a
all
lot.
ears.
Um, One that I did recently, I took a look at the Indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consultation or consent. It's written both ways, and that's a right that governments have to meaningfully consult with Indigenous peoples before taking actions that affect them, and it's a right that's most often implicated when in the face of extractive projects, so oil and mining, logging, and it the right is grounded in the recognition that indigenous peoples are sovereign. They have inherent sovereignty. It's not something governments give to them, that they inherently have the right to make decisions about their lives and their futures. And again and again and again, this right is like just trampled on. Uh, and I mean, just important context that international law really was so late to the game and even recognizing that indigenous peoples have rights. I think the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it was like 2007, I want to say, that it came into, or it was concluded, and even then faced opposition from the United States and Australia and Canada and other sort of heavily colonial governments. But I wrote about it again. It was another case in Ecuador where the Ecuadorian government wanted to auction off oil rights on indigenous lands of Warani people and other indigenous peoples, and their consultation process consisted of the government kind of flying in on helicopters to a fraction of communities impacted, sort of offering gifts for them to sign papers, talking in Spanish, not their indigenous Waltero language, really kind of like minimum things. And Warani groups filed a lawsuit and they ultimately prevailed. And Ecuador's one of several countries kind of working out, like, what does FPIC, free, prior, and informed consultation, what does FPIC mean? Does it require governments to go through like a consultation process, and then at the end, even if indigenous people say no, we don't want it, the government can do it anyways, because that is what happens? And you know, I, I think this is something that should be way more widely reported on, because it gets to the core of like human dignity, like a core right. Um, and in Ecuador, um, even I mean, there's uncontacted peoples, and the oil frontier keeps expanding in on them, and so these questions just they become all the more pressing and salient. And if we like to think of ourselves as you know abiding by the law, these things are in law now. So um, I think this should FPIC stuff should be examined more, reported on more deeply.
Yeah. No, it's also so contradictory that we always say that these are the communities, the frontliners, the first responders are the people who happen to face the brunt the most. But more often than not, they are the ones who are least communicated or taken in confidence about a particular project. So, for example, like the project that you were talking about, like these people would be displaced, but will they even benefit from the electricity that would be produced? Maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
So it's so contradictory that the people, they are the ones who are the most affected, whose fate gets decided, but are never consulted. And even if they're consulted in the manner that you just talked right now. So that's quite unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, it's something I've seen over and over again in my reporting. And you hit on something really important too, which is, the benefits flow one place and the burdens are somewhere else. And that fundamental disconnection, right? Like the shielding of consumers on the other end of this, the shielding of, shareholders from seeing or understanding the impacts. I mean, that's like a core. That's a core part to all of this. It's hidden in the supply chains. And there's so many great journalists out there doing work to try to connect those dots for people.
Katie, one would imagine that like climate litigation as such, as a response to some of these established, you know, so to say, customary laws, which are recognized by everyone, or so to say, international treaties, which now codify what is required. One would imagine that these principles would be getting litigated somewhere in international courts. I recollect that you've reported about some of the litigations as well. Would you want to take some time and maybe highlight like what is happening on the climate litigation front, and is it yielding results which one would expect?
Yeah, I mean, climate litigation as a category is enormous.
Yeah.
It's exploded in recent years, and so I mean, it depends on sort of what slice you look at. Um, in the United States, there's been a lot of lawsuits against oil majors on various kind of theories, negligence or false advertising, and they are taking a really long time to play out. Like courts are saying it belongs in federal, or the litigants say it belongs in federal court or state court, and they're kind of working their way through. I should just a plug for Inside Climate News. It was before my time, but we are the news organization that broke the Exxon new, um, you know, uh, investigative reporting by former Inside Climate News journalists, found out that Exxon did know about the consequences of the product it was selling a long time ago, but what it knew was very different from its public statements and the policies it pursued. And so that history, it's not just Exxon. A lot of the oil majors had the same sort of knowledge and dissonance between what they were doing in public. That is a basis of some lawsuits that are playing out. For me, I think I've always loved international law, and there's a couple advisory opinion requests from different international tribunals. My count is four. The International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, which issued its AO, which was very, strongly in favor of governments have obligations to address climate change. One before the International Court of Justice, which is pending, before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and I understand that one's coming out soon, and one that was filed before the African Court of Human Rights just recently. So those are interesting because the three that are pending, at least, they're looking at human rights law, and that's of course my area of interest. But there is a broader shift I see, and the litigation kind of reflects it, that this isn't like just a technical environmental issue. It's a human rights issue. It's a human rights crisis. And so for me, that's an area I think is interesting for people to follow and kind of understand, because the law shapes our thinking. It shapes our thinking of what's acceptable. And courts seem to be saying that, this is not just like a siloed environmental thing. It's a human rights thing.
And I think relying on a body of law which is much more evolved gives a lot more tools to be able to connect it with other branches. Of course, human rights law is something which has evolved over a period of time, and I think environmental movement is a lot to gain. And I think right to healthy environment, also relying on human rights, did made great strides, passed as a UN resolution, amongst other things. So yeah. Katie, this reminds me, I mean, I'm just curious to know this from you, that are there also international instruments which maybe somehow connect war and climate change? I mean, I'm just curious from the perspective, like, has there been any reporting with respect to can wars be also treated as ecocide, or I'm
Yeah.
just like it's just a curious mind, trying to connect whatever is available, because one would
Yeah.
imagine that in today's time when there are wars on multiple fronts, and of course there are issues that respective countries want to address, but there's one common thing that we all are failing to address is the harm to environment, and then again like the cost that we will incur to rebuild those cities. I don't see a lot of course talk, because there are other charged up issues on both ends,
Yeah.
but is there some work reporting happening on those fronts as well?
Yeah, and well, so Ecocide too was it was one of the first things I reported on at Inside Climate News. Ecocide, so the idea of making, a fifth international crime of mass harm to the environment, and this if you step back and look at the history of international criminal law, of course you can go way, way back, but in the modern era, this begins with the Nuremberg trials in the wake of World War II and a push to create, a crime of aggression, invading another country, crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. And this culminated in the creation of the International Criminal Court, and those are the crimes before the court. And it's been a while since I've looked at this or had a deep think about it, but I believe that in the statute of the International Criminal Court, I mean, harm to the environment is in there in some respect, but what advocates want to do now is create a standalone crime that doesn't require human harm, right? That it's in that way, it's sort of the criminal side of the rights of nature. And we're not talking like you cut down a tree and you get charged with ecocide. We're talking like Exxon Valdez or Deepwater Horizon or, nuclear, fallout, like massive, massive crimes. And it advocates behind this say, it creates a stigma, right? It's like law shaping our thinking, that killing the environment in a systemic or large scale way is so repugnant that like this stands as one of the worst things a human can do. But then also, I mean, it can have a catalyzing effect. Like insurers are not going to want to insure projects where, the CEO of the company could end up in the dock at The Hague. So that changes financial flows. Those are some of the arguments I've heard folks make. And, there, the term ecocide, I think it took off after Vietnam era when the U.S. dumped Agent Orange indiscriminately, and a number of countries like put into place ecocide laws at the time, and I think they were like post-Soviet countries. So I believe Ukraine has an ecocide law. Of course, the content, I don't know how strong it is, but there's been talk and like kind of movement around Ukraine and ecocide with what Russia has done in the country. So I think it's a really interesting thing to watch. And a number of countries have endorsed, adding ecocide as a fifth crime to the Rome Statute, which is the founding treaty of the International Criminal Court. So good. It's an area to watch.
Talking about areas to watch and interesting developments, is there a success story, Katie, would you think should be highlighted more? A success story which could give hope or inspire, action or on those lines?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. Um, looking to communities, right? Again, like grassroots communities. And I've gotten to attend two, they're called FOSPA, is the acronym conferences. They're Pan-Amazonian conferences, one in Belém, Brazil, where the COP this year is going to be taking place, and one in Roranabaque, Bolivia. And, you know, it's a lot of grassroots communities from across Amazonian countries that come together and they talk about their struggles, but also their solutions. And, and again, their solutions are drawn from their way of seeing the world. And, one of those things is uh, they're pushing for a regional treaty that recognizes the rights of the Amazon. And foundational to that is that when they look at the Amazon, they see it as a biome, as a living, self-regulating biome with a water cycle, with connectivity between different habitats for species. When we look at it, we see Brazil's, portion with these, imaginary lines we draw on a map, and Bolivia's and Ecuador's. I think there's 8 or 9, I should know that, Amazonian countries. And they want to have the rights of the Amazon recognized. Of course, it would be like a legal lever, much in the same way that Ecuador, and I think there's like more than 40 countries that have some sort of rights of nature law in the books. And I mean it's I think that's interesting. I think paying attention to what those grassroots groups are saying and doing, because they hold so much knowledge about the way ecosystems work. These systems that are vital for all of us. So looking at what they're doing, they're pushing for the rights of the Amazon, some sort of treaty going into the COP. I don't know how politically feasible that will be, because Ecuador had a recent election and their sort of right-wing president, Daniel Noboa, was reelected, and I don't see him signing on to something like that. But developments like that, I think, are undercovered again.
Yeah. Katie, we are approaching the end of our conversation, and before that, I'm just curious if there is any particular call to action that maybe you might want to share with our listeners. It could be from the perspective of a lawyer, it could be from the perspective of a journalist. Why why I always try and include this is because it gives the speaker a chance to distill what they've learned and maybe articulate it in whatever form they want, and communicate with the listeners directly. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So speak as a journalist.
Yeah.
I think uh, journalism is very different from comms, communications, right? Like we go out into the world and at our best, we try to bear witness and document information and share it with the public so that people can make informed decisions. And journalism is really under attack right now all over the world. There's different indicators and organizations that track this, and press freedoms are backsliding. Journalists are killed sometimes for doing their work. And so I would just say, I mean, my call to action would be to, support journalism, subscribe, pay, donate to whatever, news organization that you like, but support that work, support the Committee to Protect Journalists. We, if people don't know, they can't act, and so we try to make sure that people know.
Thank you so much, Katie, for all these insights and all sharing your perspective, sharing your on-ground experience. I, for one, am a regular reader of Inside Climate News, and I hugely benefit from the reporting that you and your team does. So thank you so much for taking out time and sharing your views. I'm incredibly grateful, and I hope listeners can gain different perspectives that we don't often hear or don't often make headlines. So thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And you have such a great podcast. It was an honor to be on it.
Thank you, Kate.